a critical mass. And just FYI, we're going to be recording this. Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. Happy Eid in advance. My name is Mary Boyer. I'm a disaster risk management specialist at the World Bank at the Global Facility for Reduction and Recovery. At the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery. Sorry, Niels. And I co-lead the global program for the Disaster-FCV Nexus, along with Karima Benbi. This global program has the ultimate goal of supporting regions and supporting TTLs to engage with countries currently experiencing conflict or fragility and to help them strengthen their resilience to disasters. We do this by identifying gaps in disaster risk management and designing conflict-sensitive approaches to address them. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that, especially in countries that are vulnerable to a number of natural hazards, building resilience to natural hazards and climate impacts has spillover effects to other types of resilience, and potentially even addressing root causes of conflict. This is the third webinar in a series addressing themes relevant to this topic, and I'm very excited for these speakers we have today. Dr. Mona Harb, a professor of urban studies and politics from the American University in Beirut, and Dr. Jerry Chandler, Director General of the Directorate General of Civil Protection in Haiti. They're going to give some case studies on the challenges of governance and management of disaster response in fragile states. And while they'll be describing an event-specific governance challenges, they will also touch on, and Naraya and Spiros will later elaborate on, what this means for broader DRM governance. But first, I'd like to invite Michelle Matera, chair of this webinar and lead DRM specialist at the World Bank for Western and Central Africa, to give some opening remarks and share his global perspective on the topic of DRM governance in fragile and conflict-affected states, coming from his years of experience in FCV settings, some of that in Haiti. Michelle, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Mary. Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Mary, Karima, Niels, for inviting me to open this event. So I was asked to give a few remarks on this webinar on the role of DRM governance in FCV setting. So I'm not myself an FCV expert, but as Mary mentioned, I've spent quite some time in FCV countries, including recently in Mozambique, where I spent close to 7 years, and in recent years I've been exposed on the work done by the bank on better understanding the root cause of conflicts and the drivers of fragility, and to look at what we do at the World Bank through an FCV lens, including what we do in the field of disaster risk management. So I'll give a few remarks on that. And overall, the interplay between disasters, conflict, fragility, and violence is a topic that has not been very well studied, but there are evidence that fragility and disasters are mutually reinforcing. On one hand, disaster can increase the risk of conflict, and on the other hand, conflict and fragility can also increase vulnerability to natural hazard, and also weaken the capacity of governments and local institutions to protect communities from and to respond to disasters. So it's not a coincidence that out of 37 countries that the bank classifies as FCV, 23 are in the top 30 most vulnerable countries to climate risk, according to the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Initiative country index. As Mary mentioned, I've had long-term engagement in 2 of these countries that are both classified as FCV and that are also at very high risk of disasters, Haiti and Mozambique. So we'll hear today from 2 speakers. Mona will talk about the case of Lebanon, and Jerry about the case of Haiti, which I am of course more familiar with. So my first remark, and without predicting what Jerry will say about Haiti, I wanted to highlight the importance of of long-term and sustained engagement in building community preparedness, especially in an FCV environment where the capacities of government can be constrained for multiple reasons. More than 20 years ago, the Haitian government, through its National Disaster Risk Management Plan, which was approved in 2000, has put a lot of emphasis on building the capacity of local disaster risk management committees to be better prepared to respond to disaster and to engage in disaster risk reduction works at community level. This approach has been supported by multiple partners, including the World Bank, over a long period and throughout multiple crises which impacted Haiti, from the 2010 earthquake to more recent cyclone and crisis. This long-term and sustained effort has paid off. The review of several post-disaster response has shown and documented a positive trend in the role played by those local committees in preparing for disaster, including after the devastating earthquake in 2010. And also this participatory engagement of the community in the planning and implementation of small disaster reduction works have increased the awareness of local communities and also strengthen the credibility of those committees. So really to bypass the gridlock that central institution can face in an FCV setting, this long-term focus on building local capacities for disaster risk management and building the engagement and ownership at the local level so that local actors become partners in disaster preparedness, while relying also on the peer pressure from the beneficiaries has been critical. So that's the first remark. The second remark I wanted to say is that in an FCV environment where often the social contract between government and citizen is broken, ensuring that authorities have the financial and operational capacity to respond to emergencies and disaster is also critical and should not be substituted, but rather complemented by effort from civil society organization and humanitarian actors. This has been key also in northern Mozambique, a region which, after being impacted by a massive cyclone in 2019, Cyclone Kenneth, has suffered from conflict and violence from insurgent movement and seen the forced displacement of more than 1 million people. In Mozambique, the Disaster Management Fund that was established in 2018 and the disaster preparedness capacity established over the years has been critical in responding to the early needs of the displaced population and to maintain a presence of the state in a context where there was really a surge of humanitarian international organization. So I'll stop here. I want to give the floor to the two great speakers we have today, and I look forward to the discussion afterwards. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Michel. I really enjoy your reflection on bypassing that gridlock that central institutions sometimes face to empower local institutions. And I think that both speakers will reflect on that somewhat as well. Now I'd really like to introduce Dr. Mona Harb, who is a political science and urban governance professor at the American University in Beirut. She'll share some experiences and her expertise from urban governance in Beirut, while also playing a huge role in the recovery efforts after the explosion. So Dr. Harb, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully it will work. Okay, you see it? Hello?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for having me. It's a a pleasure and an honor to be here and share some reflections on the case of Lebanon. Often when I present this talk and I title it Disaster Governance, my colleagues at the Beirut Urban Lab joke and say you should title it Disastrous Governance, the case of Lebanon. So we'll see about that in a minute.
Do you mind making your presentation full screen? Can you make your presentation full screen?
Yes, sure. Yeah.
There you go. That's better. Great.
Works?
Yeah.
Okay, so just a few words on the fact that this is part of an ongoing research project. I'm co-leading with Dr. Sami Atallah at the Policy Initiative in Beirut and a research team of several researchers. You see their names on the slide. So this is a project where we're investigating who governs in context of dysfunctional states like Lebanon, what is governed and what is not governed and how. First, let me begin by saying a few words about the disaster that is the focus of the presentation. This refers to the port explosion that destroyed a third of the city of Beirut on August 4, 2020, almost 2.5 years ago. This is an explosion, for those who don't know, that killed 214 people and injured more than 6,500 individuals and damaged around 300,000 buildings. And as I said, this forms a third of the city, and a lot of the buildings that were damaged were in the historical pericentral neighborhoods of the city. So this is, you see here, a map that documents the damage. The dark red is the parts that were the most damaged. It's produced by the Order of Engineers and Architects and uses a base map that we produced at the Beirut Urban Lab of AUB, which I co-direct. So as you, some of you probably know, this is, I mean, our country is no stranger to destructions and reconstructions, and this time, however, it's quite different than previous episodes of reconstruction we had. We currently do not have a billionaire prime minister to rebuild a part of the city like happened in Solidaire with Hariri, with Rafiq Hariri for downtown Beirut, and we don't have a powerful political sectarian party to lead the reconstruction like what happened in 2006 after the Israeli war on Lebanon with Hezbollah, who rebuilt Har Tahrir. We have actually quite the contrary. We have a delegitimized government and a collapsed economy. Again, I'm sure you're familiar with that context, but Lebanon is bankrupt. It's ruled by what is often referred to as an oligarchy or kleptocrats, and by banks that have squandered people's money. Interestingly, however, Lebanon is also quite rich with amazing human capital and a vibrant society that is organized in political groups and NGOs, and that have mobilized in unprecedented ways in October 2019. So that was an exceptional uprising, and it was also exceptionally repressed by very strong counter-revolutionary forces aided by the pandemic that came at a very opportune time and helped to completely stop that uprising and that movement. So we're in a situation where we don't have a strong public actor, but we have strong groups that mobilized to rebuild Beirut after the blast. So to be fair, the government did some interventions. So the Higher Relief Council sent some of its obsolete tanks to clean some of the rubble and the glass. It issued a law 194, that sought to curb the real estate speculation and give some support to the inhabitants of the neighborhoods affected by the blast. It was partially implemented. And more importantly, what happened is that the government decided to create a unit formed by army men that it named the Forward Emergency Room, that it placed in the municipality of Beirut. You can see the building of the municipality here. So the first floor was taken up by the Forward Emergency Room. It was supported by IRC, the Red Cross, and by UN OCHA, and it divided the areas affected by the blast into this map and assigned to INGOs and NGOs a distribution of territories to provide relief and services and goods. So about 300 organizations registered with the FER, with this forward emergency room. I don't have the time to go in the detail of this, how it went and how it was, but very quickly, it wasn't a very effective coordination. Many NGOs that registered did not follow up with the emergency room. So it was very hard to know who did what where. There was a lot of overlaps, also a lot of changes. So people who registered in one area went and worked in another area, etc. So in parallel to that, there was work happening at another scale, but I'll come back to that in a minute. What I want to say here is that this response also aligned on the response that was put about 10 years earlier for the Syrian refugee crisis. So these sector working groups and these this logic of intervention was very much parallel to another response to another crisis, which reminds us that often in those contexts we have multiple crises that are interlocking, what people are referring to now more and more as polycrisis. So a lot of people refer to Lebanon's reconstruction at the time, including myself and my colleague Mona Fawaz, as a reconstruction that was going to be led by a republic of NGOs, and that Haiti would be a comparative model. I got very interested in unpacking who are those NGOs as part of our project with TPI. And so we conducted a survey with close to 90 actors who had provided goods and services after the blast, and we identified 6 categories of actors actually on the ground. So national non-governmental organizations, international ones, faith-based organizations, national and international ones, in addition to political groups, as well as universities and loose initiatives, research collectives or collectives that were not organized as NGOs that provided some type of good or service in response to the blast. We also identified 2 broad clusters. 2/3 of those actors are mostly composed of non-governmental organizations that are, to make it short, that are non-sectarian, that are non-aligned on mainstream hegemonic politics in Lebanon. And 1/3 of them are more associated with political and religious groups, either in power or international faith-based organizations that operate in Lebanon for a long time. Again, this is, I'm not focusing on this today, but I'll be happy to answer questions if you have on that. What's interesting about those actors is that the goods they're provided are not all of an individualistic or particularistic type. So they're not only targeting individuals and households, but many of those actors have been investing in what we termed collective types of goods. So goods that seek to improve neighborhoods, that seek to restore heritage. As I said, the blast affected a lot of heritage buildings in these neighborhoods, that seek to also repair community facilities, public and shared spaces, and small infrastructures such as sidewalks and staircases like you see in those images here. Ourselves at the Beirut Urban Lab have been very involved in trying to push and advocate for an urban strategy that advance an urban recovery and the public domain. So this is the latest version of a pilot urban strategy we've been pushing to reconnect neighborhoods in Beirut together and to reconnect the city to the port. So this is the type of work that is being done by this multiplicity of actors. So in parallel to all this work that's happening by these, to make it short, non-state actors, international organizations mobilized and formed the Recovery Reconstruction Framework for Lebanon. You know very well the protocol, I don't need to explain to you, and our DNA was done. It followed with a document called the Lebanon 3RF, and the platform was made, and as was introduced by Michelle earlier, there was a very strong insistence on including civil society organizations in the institutional architecture of the 3RF. So it was, in many ways, it's a very innovative, I would say, institutional architecture. And this is what we're trying to assess with TPI in our work. We're trying to answer these two questions. To what extent, as this innovative aid program, Lebanon 3RF was effective in terms of its architecture and its inclusion of CSOs in two of its units, the consultative group and sector working groups. And 2 years later, what did the 3RF achieve in terms of outcomes? And to answer this question, we look at institutional strengthening, project making, and legislative reforms. So in terms of institutional architecture, the 3RF is articulated around a technical team and secretariat that groups the representatives from the EU, the European Union, UN agencies, and the World Bank. They also established the Lebanese financing facility that is sort of the trust fund for this framework. There are two units in this institutional architecture that involve civil society organizations, the consultative group that you see here, which groups CSOs, as well as the independent oversight board that is composed exclusively of CSOs that's supposed to have oversight over the 3RF itself. So the Beirut Urban Lab, where I work at AUB, was a member of the consultative group. We applied to the call for interest that was issued by the 3RF in December or January 2020, and we got selected as one of the 15 CSOs that made up this consultative group, alongside representatives of the donors, the UN, and the government. So in terms of methodology, I need to say a few words that our findings are built on our participant observation as a member of the consultative group, and that we very much take the position of scholar activists that were attempting to influence the governance process of the disaster response, in line with many critical disaster studies advocates that inspired us in this work. We also did 24 key informant interviews with representatives of the international community and representatives of CSOs inside the 3RF. In addition to desk research using published and unpublished documents, we got access to as representatives in the consultative group. So with that said, let's move to the first, I would say, assessment of the role of CSOs in the 3RF by looking at what happened in that consultative group. So we began with our general remarks on the selection process, which was restricted in terms of participation. The call for participation was in English. It restricted participation to a certain profile of CSOs, mainly CSOs that were active in the uprising. So we had one FBO, for instance, on board, and although I mean, these are details. I will skip that because I'm conscious of time, but we can go back to it. So the selection process in itself was rather restricted in terms of participation, and the members on the CSOs do not reflect the full diversity of the civil society groups that I showed you earlier. In terms of operational modalities, there were insufficient flows of information to the consultative group. The TORs that guided their work were quite generic. This was justified by donors that they didn't want to impose on CSOs modalities of work, but knowing the levels of I would say incoherence within the civil society of Lebanon, like any other civil society, this created inefficiencies inside the consultative group itself. At the donor level, there was no institutional support to the consultative group, no financial support, and of course, over time, the volunteering dimension of serving in that consultative group led to the fact that very few people stayed on board and attended meetings. There was also donor inertia that delayed the creation of a website, efficient flows of communication. There were internal issues among donors that made things not go too well in terms of that meta management. At the government level, as I said before, we're dealing with delegitimized ruling elite who look at CSOs as opposition groups, and they are unkeen of engaging them. So also they were not keen on giving a voice to CSOs and giving them and endowing them with effective decision making. And at the CSOs level themselves, there's a lot of fragmentation, even competition, lack of cohesion. This is a sector that's professionalized like everywhere else, and that lacks funding. We felt that very strongly when the war in Ukraine started, and there was a lot of defunding that happened with many. It was very difficult to self-organize within these CSOs. Now, if we look at the sector working groups, which is the other modality through which decision-making was engaging them, again, here we see vagueness and lack of clarity with regard to membership and governance, TORs and operational modalities, but also at the level of government representation. These are supposed to group people from government, from the donors and the CSOs. We see that a lot of the sector working groups, there were 14 of them, lacked effective government representation. Sometimes there would be a government representative, but they would have no teeth to make any decision. So the sector working group themselves would be inefficient. There was also a lack of clarity on how to join these sector working groups and how to operate within them. Yet, currently, the 3RF is focusing a lot on them as effective devices for institutional reforms. And my position on this, that this could be a much more interesting device through which the 3RF could operate rather than the consultative groups. Things are in the making as we speak. So, so there has been a consolidation of these sector working groups in a smaller number, and time will tell if things will go more effectively as we move forwards. There are good signs that can indicate that. Now, if we move to the institutional strengthening efforts of the 3RF. So here there were two asks by the consultative group and the CSOs to establish a central management unit at the Council of Ministers level and to establish a planning and coordination unit at the municipality level. And interestingly, both attempts at creating these institutions that would have helped a lot CSOs have durable positions of decision making inside the government and inside the municipality were blocked. At the CMU was blocked by the Prime Minister office itself, and the PCU was blocked by donors' internal politics. Again, these are anecdotal stories. I can go in detail if you want later, but this is to give you an idea about what was happening at that front. So we move to this, the second front through which to assess the outcomes of the 3RF is project making. And here we see a lot of materialization of projects. 4 projects were put on track. The one that targeted small and medium enterprises, the B5, Building Back Beirut Businesses Better. One that targeted the housing rehabilitation and cultural and creative industries recovery project. One that targeted the social recovery services, and one that targeted environmental recovery. All these projects were launched or are in the process. I mean, some have been launched, some are being launched as we speak or are in their early phases. Yet there were challenges here that are important to mention: bureaucracy, slow process of implementation, and some concerns about elite capture in the procurement processes. Of course, in Lebanon, we're very sensitive to this, given stories of corruption in other public agencies that give preeminence to firms connected to the elites that are known for their corruption as well. So there were doubts about reiterating these processes through the 3RF as well. So this is the last part of my presentation. So we assess here the outcome of the 3RF with regard to legislative reforms. And for this, we use the monitoring framework that was shared by the 3RF Secretariat in June 2022 that documents 138 action points that are listed in the 3RF document. And to assess what are these action points about, we used a framework that was developed by colleagues at TPI, which identify action points in relation to their legal hierarchy. So we'll look at each action point, at each of the 138 action points, and we code them in relation to if they're a law or a decree or a decision, because each one would require a different level of political commitment linked to its issuing body. So to give you an example, if we need a law, we need the parliament to issue it, which requires a very high level of political commitment. So we did this for the 138 action points. So actually, this is an example of the methodology. We take the example of the public procurement law. For this, we need two legislations. One of them is a law, one is a decree, and we code it accordingly in our data set. And based on that, we produce these statistics. So we are able to show that 47% of the 3RF's action points need legislative efforts that are high. So they, I mean, actually, they're not all high. They need legislative efforts. So of the 138 action points, 86 of these require 86 legislation that are divided according to these sectors. I'll skip that for the time's sake. We also show that more than 60% of these 3RF reforms are actually old ones and were part of previous aid programs. Lebanon has a rich history of aid programs that were unachieved, that are named Paris 1, 2, and 3, and CEDR. TPI had done previous work assessing the results of these aid programs. So we use this data and we use the same methodology to do the comparison. So this is how we got the 60% number, that most of these reforms were already carried out from previous agenda that were not achieved. We also show that 2 years later, the 3RF reform yield is low, and it's very comparable to the 3RF. So in terms of percentage of laws that were achieved, we only have 16%. And during Paris 3, after Paris 3, there were 14 decrees. We have 10%. We had more decrees issued after Paris 3, and the number of decisions, ministerial decisions, is almost the same, 52%. So we're quite consistent in not meeting our commitments and our pledges after these 8 reforms. This table shows you which laws, decrees, and decisions were passed. I don't know if you're able to go through it. I know I'm going quite quickly. So I conclude, and I'm happy to go back to on any point if you'd like, to answer our questions. So to what extent the 3RF has been an innovative aid process, or an effective innovative aid process? It's definitely an innovative aid process. In Lebanon, it successfully created new institutional modalities that engage CSOs through the consultative group and sector working groups, and that gave them voice at a high level at the decision-making table. However, these modalities did not fully enable CSOs to act as influential policy advocates. They were constrained, and their capacity for policy advocacy was quite limited. So today, a lot of them are operating outside of the 3RF, their advocacy. In terms of outcomes, 2 years later, we saw that in terms of institution strengthening, we did not manage to build institutions through the 3RF. We managed to successfully implement and elaborate 4 projects. And at the level of reforms, the yield is quite low. So the 3RF participated partially to the adoption of legislative reforms, similarly to previous aid models. This raises questions on the issue of the conditionality of aid in general. And I think in that sense, Lebanon is an interesting case study that shows the limits of conditional aid as vehicles of reform in the context of states like Lebanon that are dominated by kleptocratic ruling elite, and in the context as well of donors' inertia and donors' competition and internal politics as well. Let's not forget that. Also, it shows the limits of CSOs in state building, and the fact that they cannot operate very much beyond an effective state. So I'll stop with those thoughts and look forward to your comments and our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Harb, for those really interesting findings on the 3RF process, which almost sounds more like a long-term development plan at this point. In the interest of time, I'll ask us all to keep our questions until we finish with all the speakers. I'd like to now introduce Dr. Jerry Chandler, who is the Director General of the Directorate General of Civil Protection in Haiti. And I'd also like to note that we have Mr. Fitzgerald Louis connecting as well, who is an economist at the Ministry of Finance and focal point for all World Bank, for the entire World Bank portfolio in Haiti. So welcome also, Fritz. Dr. Chandler, over to you.
Thank you. I don't know if you can hear me.
We can hear you, thanks.
Okay, very good. I'm gonna try to share the presentation. Okay, I don't know if it's shown or if you guys can see it.
We see it great.
Okay, excellent. So today I'm very happy to be with you guys, and I'm very happy and honored to be part of this panel for those discussions. And then this, as the subject itself is a very interesting and very important subject. As you all know, and I think Michel mentioned it in his introduction, IT has been very much and very often the stage of multiple crises and multiple situations where we have had to manage and to respond. But the good thing is that as time went by, there has been capacity strengthening initiatives, and we have been learning lessons. So today we're gonna be talking about how governance can shift the balance in management of disaster at large. So as an introduction, what I can say is that governance, as you all know, can ensure that the response to disasters is well coordinated and efficient. That's one of the things that we're going to discuss, and I'm going to show you through that model. The second thing is also that the fact that through governance, we can ensure that the needs of the most vulnerable populations are addressed, and this is very important. And we have used tools to actually achieve this goal as well through governance. Of course, there are other issues that we still need to address and we still to move forward with. But as time goes by, and as the lessons are being learned, we are moving forward. So quickly, we're going to be talking, as I said, we will be talking about the earthquake that happened on August 14, 2021. And the earthquake occurred in a very complicated context where we were just coming out of the COVID pandemic situation. We had a complicated political situation where the president had just been assassinated. We were right in the midst of the hurricane season, and as all of our threats were there, we had the seismic risk that occurred, and we had a serious earthquake, a serious 7.2 magnitude earthquake that happened in the southern peninsula, and that impacted the entire peninsula. And to, as they used to say in English, to add insult to injury, we also had a tropical storm 2 days post impact that washed out the area that was affected by the earthquake itself. So this is just to tell you that it was a really complex situation, added to the fact that we were also at grips with security issues because it was very difficult to actually travel to the country and to go on the affected sites because of the gang wars that are occupying the southern exit of Port-au-Prince. So again, complex emergency, very complex to deal with, and of course we had to put all of our resources together so we could address it. So in terms of damage, real quick, we had over 2,000 fatalities. We had over 12,000 wounded, and there was a total population of about 700,000 people that were affected by this earthquake and its aftermath with all the aftershocks that occurred. So we managed to establish and to have that damage assessment as fast as we could. And this was done through the fact that we could use the technology and the resources that we had previously, I would say, harnessed and deployed. So again, it's all about preparedness. It's all about being ready. It's all about really harnessing and really using the technology and the tools that we have so we can move forward and have that damage. So This is just to show you the damage to infrastructure, where we had public buildings, private buildings, roads, and even a bridge that leads to one of the main departments that was collapsed and that were affected. So it was really complex. So real quick, we initiated the search and rescue process, and the local search and rescue capacity, even though it is very small and it's very light, it was there. It was there practically 8 hours post impact, and they did a great job doing the search and rescue work. So they actually rescued and saved a lot of people. Of course, the international rescue teams came afterwards and went on with the work. But this is also to emphasize the fact that the local capacity is the first one that certainly will be responding, and it's certainly that will be on site. So right now, the lesson to be learned from that is to actually reinforce the capacity, give them more training, give them more equipment, so that they can actually do so they can actually do the do's and intervention. One of the interesting facts is the fact that the equipment that was used by the search and rescue team is the same equipment that was donated after the 2010 earthquake in Port-au-Prince. So this is to tell you that it is sustainable, it can be done, and if we can direct them correctly, we can have a search and rescue capacity that is efficient. Of course, it was a medical emergency. We had an outpour of support from the international community, and this leads me to another piece of the governance. It's all about coordination. So we had a lot of resources from the US, from the US and from the neighboring countries. They came with helicopters, they came with boats, they came with all kinds of heavy equipment for transport. So we were in the middle of that. We were coordinating the evacuation, the medical evacuation of the patients, and we were also doing we had our people on site also helping with triage, so we could move the patients that needed most medical emergency care, and actually move the other patients that needed less specialized emergency care to the EMTs, the field hospital that were being deployed in the area. Again, governance, coordination, we were on top of it, and we try to use and make the best of what was available. Of course, we also had a huge outpour of assistance. We had a lot of our neighboring countries that came to the rescue, and they helped us with the basic needs, the NFIs, the non-food items, also the food and the water, and as you know, the medical support that we needed. And we managed to actually get convoys of vehicle out to the Greater South, and we managed also to within the nick of the first month and a half to have to reach about the first month we managed to reach about 70,000 families in the immediate response, in terms of immediate assistance. Of course, the other thing that we had to do in using the technology that we already had was to actually keep track of what the needs were. What did we do? Where was the support being brought? But also, what were the needs? And those are also points that we did, and that as you can see in that mapping, that partial mapping of distribution, as we were going on with the distribution efforts, we could see and have a good idea of where the efforts were going, but also where we needed to actually emphasize or put more efforts, because there were lacks or there were gaps. So again, use of technology and good common sense to actually get the response to be evened out and to be and to actually reach the people that were in need. This slide is very interesting in the sense that I wanted to show you that the coordination piece, and unfortunately the video will not start. But the idea is to actually show you that coordination is the key to this type of complex disasters, where you have all kinds of actors that are involved. And in the picture, you will certainly see some military people, you will see UN people, you will also see people from Protection Civil, you will see people from the Red Cross. They all came together, all came down together, did what they had to do, so they could actually bring the help and bring the response to the affected population. And again, we got the result that we needed. In terms of international assistance, there was, as I was saying, there was a huge outpour of help and support, and we had also a lot of bilateral aid. A lot of countries, as I said before, came to the rescue and came to help. But again, we also had to manage to actually have pre-existing lists of needs, so that we would not fall in the same problems where we had a lot of things coming in, but we would receive a lot of things that we would not need as well. So that was the idea, and this worked very well, and we managed to get what we needed for the population, and we could actually get those supplies and get them out to the affected areas. One of the interesting points that were that was to be noted in the response to this earthquake is the solidarity. Really, the individual humanitarians and the institutions and the private sector, everybody got on board. Everybody played their role and did their part, and that made the work easier, and that gave us hope in terms of what we are doing, and seeing that it was working the way it was supposed to. Real quick, in terms of like I was saying, in terms of use of technology, what we also did was to actually identify the urgent needs, as I said, so we could establish the list of what was needed. And we saw that there was a lot of requests for temporary sheltering, water, food, but of course other non-food items and that were being needed. And we actually conducted like this little mini surveys where in each affected department we could see exactly where what the gaps were, what were the requests. For instance, if you take the NIP department, the people were asking more for food than water. But if you take the gunners, it would be a little bit different, because you would see that in the gunners, the needs were more for shelter. Whereas in the south, it would be food and shelter, evenly divided. So again, the use of technology helped us see through all of this and helped us move forward with the right decisions. 6 months down the road, when we were done with the response, we did a lessons learned workshop where we sat down with all the key players. We discussed, we talked about what went well, what didn't go so well, so we could actually correct and adjust and adapt. So we had all the actors, over 100 actors that were involved: government authorities, state officials, international partners, members of civil society, local actors. We got all of them in one room so we could discuss, and that helped us come out with I would say, a document of good practices, what we would need to correct, so that next time, because we know there's going to be a next time we have better coordination mechanisms, and we can do better, and we can handle the crisis that come up better. So we did that through a very simple methodology. We assessed the operational systems and protocols. We discussed how the strengths and weaknesses. We identified and grouped the lessons learned, and then from that, like I said, we drew up the document, the lessons learned document that also helped us reshape our protocols for response at a national level for earthquake. If when an earthquake, so that next time an earthquake happens, we know what to do. So in terms of recommendation, real quick, the main recommendations were an active monitoring of humanitarian response operations, because we kept track of what was going on, but at a certain point, 3 weeks down the road, there was a loss of interest. A lot of those actors went on their separate ways, went on to do their own thing, and so forth and so on. So the idea is to actually not lose the momentum and keep the systematic approach, so everyone would keep reporting, everyone would be on the same table until we get to the phase of recovery. Of course, there's the question of integrated work of sectors for the planning and rapid start of recovery. So the recommendation is to actually get them together so that they could so they could work closely together, not only in terms of response, but pre-disaster, so they can have, so first of all, so they can do work on the mitigation piece, but also so they can know what the protocols are, what how to act and how to integrate the response mechanism. Of course, other point is an increased coordination with the Ministry of Planning and the donors for the rapid initiation of recovery. as I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation, we managed to actually have the assessment rapidly, and we did it with the use of technology, with the use of satellite imagery, with the use of GPS with our people on the ground that went to confirm the damage that we could see. So the idea is to actually move forward quickly, get the people relocated, and move and get the process for recovery up and going as fast as possible. So again, like I said, the idea is to actually have a better, a better coordination, and have more a more intricate communication with with those line ministries, such as Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Planning, that are actually working towards that are very much involved in the recovery process. So in conclusion, we know that effective governance is critical to ensuring the balance, to ensuring that the balance is tilted in favor of disaster management. So by prioritizing disaster risk reduction, coordinating emergency response effort, and addressing the needs of the most vulnerable, and supporting the long-term recovery efforts, governance can help minimize the impact of disaster and build more resilient communities. Then again, we have done a decent work. As Michel stated in his introduction, we've come a long way. But we still have a long way to go. We have a lot to do, but we will keep working. We will keep moving forward, and we will keep looking at the future with a lot of hope, because there have been steps. Even if we say we make baby steps, we are moving in the right direction. So I thank you all for your attention, and I'm gonna be standing by for the questions and the commentaries. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chandler. I appreciate that you mentioned the importance of coordinating with line ministries to move on to the recovery phase. You cut out a little bit during the emergency response coordination section, but I think Naraya, the next discussant, will agree that part of that coordination success was due to your leadership and your ability to command and to empower people with different specialties to take the lead in their roles. I'm going to move directly to the discussants. And in the interest of time, I'm going to ask each to limit their comments to 5 minutes. First, we have Naraya Carrasco, who's a senior DRM specialist joining us from Haiti. Naraya?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me to this BBL, and I'm happy to see Jerry Chandler, even if it's virtually, and I'm sure we're gonna meet in person soon. So yeah, I mean, my first comments are mainly related to also to highlight the progress of the DGPC. It's also related to all the improvements that have been happening over the years regarding the disaster risk management legal framework. So as Philippe Matera mentioned it at the beginning, the civil protection has been supported by the World Bank and many other partners over decades of time now. And one of the results of this constant relationship and support to the civil protection is that also in 2020, the system was officially created with a legal framework, and the DGPC was elevated to a general direction for the civil protection. And this is really having a good influence in the whole system, especially in a FCV context, where everything is even more difficult. So it surely shows the importance of having a trustful relationship. And now this legal framework provides really a legitimacy and a frame to work on, and allows the civil protection to have a line in the national budget, which is very important. And in parallel to this work related to the legal framework for the disaster risk management system, with the Ministry of Finance, we have also been working to develop a strategy on disaster risk financing. So this is also complementing the system that is already in place. And of course, the main objective of this strategy is to really help the government make the financial decisions before a disaster. This in order to minimize the cost of the disaster response, and then also to be able to react in an effective and transparent way by following appropriate rules that are established beforehand. So currently, the Ministry of Finance is working on the approval of this strategy, and maybe Mr. Fitzgerald may want to say something just after me if he's still in the call. And so I just want to highlight that all these efforts that are done over time to improve the governance of DRM in Haiti is providing all the positive impacts that Jerry mentioned in his presentation, that there is better coordination, there is better knowledge of what needs to be done. Of course, something else that is also probably helping, not only in terms of during the emergencies, but there is as part of the DRM system, there is also group that is called in French the GACI, which is an international cooperation support group, which is led by Dr. Chandler. And this group meets regularly every year, independently of having or not crisis, and it helps the donors to coordinate and have a better efficient support to the civil protection. So that's also something that is providing the bearing fruits in all this work, because as it was mentioned before, coordination is key, not only in emergencies, but also in times of, let's say, of peace, so that we can really build the system, strengthen the capacities. We still need to support the civil protection to really have all the capacity and the strength to implement all the actions that need to be done before a disaster. So now we are coming up to the hurricane season. So every year there is many actions that need to be put in place, and the civil protection needs to continue receiving all the support needed also at the local level. As Dr. Chandler mentioned, is the local teams of the civil protection that are the first ones on the ground saving lives. So that's something that we're working together to continue increasing the capacities of these local teams. And I also want to mention that the civil protection is not only involved in all the aspects of dealing with disasters, but in this FCV context that we have now in Haiti that is getting, let's say, worse with all this violence and all the gangs activities in all the country, especially in Port-au-Prince. So the civil protection is also involved in the monitoring and mitigation of internal displaced people because of gang violence. So this is kind of really stretching the capacity of the civil protection, and they are like taking care of everything to prepare for the hurricane season. At the same time, in last March, there was an estimation of 130,000 IDPs in Port-au-Prince only. So this is also something that we need to mention, the connections between FCV, DRM. As Matera mentioned it before, there is this self-reinforcing situation between FCV and DRM, but also we need to see the positive aspects. So if we have a more strong civil protection, that also can help at least to monitor and mitigate some of the impact caused by all this violence in Haiti. So with this, I just want to mention that it is really important to support disaster risk management and the civil protection or any system that is dealing with the prevention, response, and recovery, especially in FCV countries, because although there is a lot of uncertainty on what will happen, at least in Haiti, we are sure that we can have a hurricane any year, because with climate change, we have more frequent and intense hurricanes. We can have an earthquake anytime. So that was shown in 21 with the tropical storm, plus the earthquake, plus the COVID, plus the political situation, very tense. So I think it is very, I want to just give this message that we need to persevere in all the support to the national system of DRM in Haiti. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nora. And I do see Fitzgerald is still connected. If you'd like to say anything briefly. Okay, you can jump in later if during Q&A then. So we'll move on to Spiros Demetriou, Senior Operations Officer in the FCV Group, the Fragility, Conflict, and Violence Group at the World Bank. Spiros?
Do you hear me?
Thank you so much, Mary. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to join you on this panel, and I want to thank Dr. Harb and Jerry for the excellent presentations. Really, really excellent, very detailed and very clear. So I work in the FCV group at the World Bank. I've had the privilege of working in both Lebanon and in Haiti, including with Michelle. So really good to see you, Michelle, online. And I've also been involved in a number of multi-stakeholder post-conflict recovery processes. So for me, a lot of the points and the conclusions from the two recommendations, the two presentations, resonate strongly with me in terms of what I've seen in other countries and other processes when it comes to the governance of the responses and how these can impact governance and institutional strengthening more generally in FCV context. And I think that in these presentations, there are very important lessons learned, which again, I think capture some of the experience we have globally, but also point to some of the core priorities for improving that relationship. So I'd like to say a few words about what some of those points are, and then also I have some specific questions for the two speakers. So in terms of where I think the governance of responses in a post-disaster context can be very meaningful as part of broader dialogue on governance in FCV context, I think there's three, I think, very important points here, which are kind of practical points. The first is the experience and the relationships that are developed within a response framework, right, between the governments, other national actors, and international partners. This many times is extremely important. It's many times extremely innovative. People are brought together because of the urgency of the situation, and they are, in a sense, forced out of regular modus operandi to work together to address a very pressing issue, which is to assess the needs and to develop and inform, recovery planning and the coordination of the response. And in many cases, the mechanisms that get developed for assessments, for planning, for priority setting, and translating those then into programming and financial allocations, these frameworks, these models, can be extremely important and can help recast the relationship with the country more generally, but also inform the broader relationship between these actors as they work on various aspects of reform and response in the country. So many times, again, we create a modus operandi that can, if done well, can inform, arrangements across a broader range of sectors. That's number one. Number two, I think in many cases we see from the responses, by definition, the post-disaster responses will be multi-sectoral. They cover a range of different sectoral priorities and needs, and engage a range of different actors within a government or within the international community. And again, when done well, the plans that get developed can inform national strategies, policies, budgeting, reforms, planning down the road, which again in FCV context can be a very important and powerful factor in strengthening core capacities within, in many cases, governments whose capacities are challenged because of the shocks and stresses of an FCV environment, but also to propel new and innovative ways of doing things, again, in a crisis and volatile context, and we're talking about FCV context. And this is, I think, both in the case of sectoral enhancements, but also cross-sectoral, right? And I think here is one of the most important areas of capacity that these a coordinated response can bring is, generating a focus on how we create cross-sectoral, more integrated approaches to addressing complex challenges and needs and priorities in the country. Many governments, regardless of where they are, FCV or non-FCV, have challenges in doing this kind of cross-sectoral whole of government responses, right? But these are opportunities to, as I think to Jerry's point, to harness technologies, approaches, tools that allow us to do this. And the more that we can embed these in the way that governments respond, the way that individual ministries respond, this really is a very powerful byproduct, I think, of these post-crisis responses. Thirdly, again, I think that the case of Haiti, I think, shows this, very, very clearly. In a context of broader state kind of dysfunctionality and low capacity, the example of DRM in Haiti, is it's a shining light of how one can build effective capacities, effective institutions in the middle of a much broader systemic crisis, right? Many times people say, we paint the governance picture with one color, right? Including in a country like Haiti. The reality, of course, is that you have a variable geography of capacity within a particular state, and in particular the context of Haiti, as the crisis that's going through now, there's imperative to protect these centers of excellence, these capacities, and also to use them as bridgeheads in which to when there is a opening for stabilization, to replicate some of these practices, and use that more broadly from a governance capacity building perspective. So I think those are some, I think for me, some of the key points that come out, some of those presentations. At the same time, very quickly, a couple of risks, right? We have a tendency sometimes to, particularly in high emergency situations, to create governance mechanisms for responses that do not adequately anchor the government at the center and provide full ownership. And in many cases, we end up creating duplicative structures for response and coordination in a country that either bypass the government or make the government a symbol in the process. On the one hand of the spectrum, on the other hand of the spectrum, and then this is a little bit the case in Lebanon, when we favor, again, systems of implementation outside of direct government systems, we can create a certain dualism even within government, within ministries, which can kind of aggravate or further contribute to some of this dysfunctionalities that we have in governance. That's one. Number two, we have to be careful about what we want to propose for the future when we create these response frameworks. We do have a tendency, this is the big we, not just the World Bank or any particular actor, of over-engineering some of the governance mechanisms for our responses. They become exercises in micromanagements, way too much coordination, and very complicated. And we have to be very careful that we do not then seek to replicate these kinds of practices in other aspects of governance or collaboration in a country. Where we have gotten the balance right, I think, is in countries like Indonesia following the Aceh disasters, in Somalia. We do have examples of where we cut the balance correct. Enough structure, enough focus, while at the same time not over-engineering and creating inefficiencies and dysfunctionalities on its own points. And last point, and I'll stop here, is a point that Jerry made about the sustainability of the structures and the momentum that are generated through these responses. I think this is an absolutely critical point. In most cases where we've done these kinds of collective multi-stakeholder responses, we invest so much energy in the actual immediate response that once that is done, and unfortunately often at the beginning of the longer term recovery phase, everyone packs up and goes home. And we de-invest, we pull the plug in a sense, de facto, right? This often comes at a very high price, right? In terms of being able then to integrate what has come out of this response into a broader institutional field. But secondly, to maintain and to ensure that what was begun in the recovery is implemented and then sustained through government and other systems. And again, I think that Jerry's point, I think, is absolutely critical. If I may, a couple of questions both to Dr. Harben and to Jerry. This issue of CSO engagement, this is absolutely critical. And in many cases, the integration of CSOs as part of a process of response creates a very important momentum, going forward in terms of facilitating more inclusive, more accountable, more transparent governance, right? But it's a really tough one, as both presentations, I think, really kind of brought out. One is in both Lebanon and Haiti, you have incredibly diverse civil society communities, right? Not all of whom represent the best interests of communities, right? It's a bit of a mixed bag. How do we engage the right CSOs in these processes, right? And again, your insights, from your respective experience, I think would be very important in this. And secondly, how do we engage them effectively? Is it a question of procedural issues in terms of how they are engaged, or is it a question of inclusion in decision making and accountability as part of the response? Where is the challenge exactly in this? So I'd be grateful to get your reflections on this point, because I think this really is an important dimension to these governance frameworks for responses, but also then have potentially very large implications for upstream governance in FCV context. I've been a bit lengthy. Thank you so much once again, and again also for inviting me to this panel. Thanks.
Thank you, Spiros, and thanks for posing that question to kick off our Q&A. But before I let Jerry and Mona answer that, I wanted to give the floor again to Fitzgerald, if his mic is working now.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry, I have a connection issue. I would like to add a few words about what you discussed today. And also, I would like to thank Dr. Chandler and Nayara for their presentation. So I would like to speak a little bit about the role of the Ministry of Finance in terms of its contribution to strengthen disaster management in Haiti. As you know, Haiti is a FCV country, and vulnerable to climate change. We face increasing exposure to climate risk, and we have a limited budgetary space to deal with a climate shock. So with that, we are forced to make decisions in favor of a more structured risk management policy that is at the same time more preventive and more inclusive. Nayara and Dr. Chandler has mentioned that during their presentation. So the government has made progress in sustaining the governance framework for risk and disaster management. We had good result because of the support from the World Bank. We had a CADDO in the past. And with this CADDO, the government has took a lot of decisions like the publication of the institutional framework for disaster risk management, PNGRD, and this National Risk and Disaster Management System, SNGRD. We also adopt a national protection plan. Today we have a national protection plan. It's integrated in our budget. For this budget, the Ministry of Finance has allocated more than $100 million for the social protection plan. As Nayara mentioned during her presentation, so we are currently working with the World Bank on our strategy risk financing. So we will adopt this document in next days. Yesterday, I have discussed with the Minister of Finance, Michel Patrick Boisvert. We will send the document to the Council of Ministers. Maybe we will program the meeting for its adoption in the beginning of May. So I would like to request from all of you your assistance and your knowledge to bring more technical assistance to Haiti to implement the next financial strategy. And also, I would like to mention, even we don't have currently a financing strategy, more than $5 million to give to be covered for 3 periods: hurricane, earthquake, and raining, excess raining. So in our national budget, we allocate resources to pay the premium each year. And during the last disaster, the earthquake, we have received a payout of $40 million. This payout was allocated exclusively to the social protection. So the government used this money to rebuild school and hospital, and it has also used it to pay the salaries of public servants. Just to show you how much we care about that, so we are currently working with the General Direction of Civil Protection. We're also working with all of the government institutions to strengthen disaster risk management, and also include in our budgetary programming the financing strategies that will help us to reduce the economic shock and social shocks of disaster risk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fitzgerald. You raised a good point that financial management and strengthening fiscal resilience is a very important part of DRM governance. I mean, we all have to pay for it somehow. Going back to the question on CSO engagement, maybe Mona, did you want to answer that first on how do we engage with the right CSOs?
Sure. I'll give a very academic reply and say, right for whom? So it's a very difficult question. I think, thank you very much for the comments. Actually, I really enjoyed hearing you. I think this is a crucial question. I'm not sure there's a clear answer to it. I think the Lebanon case provides an interesting possibility of calling for CSOs and restricting. Because I think there's somewhere in the call that was done to who can participate in Lebanon 3RF, there was a conscious attempt, I think, on the part of the principal organizations to recruit CSOs that were more participant in the uprising, that were on the more on the non-sectarian end. I think it was spelled out very clearly. So that's one possibility of writing up a call and restricting participation to a certain profile of CSOs that aligns with certain set of values, if these values are the ones that we want to advance. Of course, the risk is that we exclude the other CSOs that are also, that exist on the ground and that are strong and effective and that represent other people on the ground and that are also civil society organization, again, like the case of Lebanon. So I think that echoes a little bit what Karima asked in the chat about that paradox that I think these interventions in such context pose many paradoxes. So I think my answer would be more about trying as much as possible to give teeth to these CSOs once we engage them. So once we put them on the table, how we can make sure that we are leveraging as much as possible these CSOs so they are effectively included. For me, one possible answer is to actually ensure a certain administrative and financial sustainability for the people who are willing to play that role. There's an assumption that, you know, CSOs are going to serve pro bono in that role for a very long period of time, which doesn't make any sense. We saw it again in Lebanon 3RF. For the first few months, everybody was sitting on the table, but then people had to go to work, had to fundraise for their own organization, had to report back to work. People cannot just stay in that role of mediation or trying to play a decision-making role without being actually employed to do it, at least partially, or finding a way to engage these CSOs more sustainably through some sort of an institutional setup. We know very well that a lot of the money in setting up these platforms go to high-level experts, often foreign experts that come and go as consultants to the country. It would be nice if part of this investment goes to locals who live in the country and who are able to play that role in addition to their roles in the CSOs. For me, it's a very straightforward possibility. Some CSOs ask for it directly in the case of Lebanon. So that's a possibility. In Lebanon, CSOs really expect donors to lobby on their behalf the government that's not listening to them. So that also replies to one question that Mr. Spiridon asked about how to make sure to keep the momentum and the sustainability of the intervention. And maybe I'll take that segue to answer Karima. I think CSOs have this expectation that given the government is not listening to them, donors could lobby on their behalf, so they have more of a front seat. So if we take a concrete example of the legislative reform, currently the new law of public procurement was passed in Parliament, but currently, as we speak, I think earlier this week, the Parliament was discussing, before passing this law with its decrees, it was reformulating the law in a way that empties the law from its substance, hollowing it out, which is a typical strategy of government. So what those CSOs that were lobbying for these laws wanted was a seat inside the parliament, so they could be able to counter that. And they were hoping that international organizations like the EU, the World Bank, or UN agencies would be able to secure that presence inside the parliament. It's probably wishful thinking, but I think this is the expectation from the CSOs. But I totally agree that at some point there's a glass ceiling. You cannot go beyond a certain level in lobbying, and you really need public institutions that are champions, that are able to carry these reforms forward, like we're seeing with Dr. Jerry and the example of Dr. Chandler and the example of Haiti. I'm very curious to know more how the civil protection became institutionalized. What were the conditions that allowed the institutionalization of the civil protection? Because we were really eager with the World Bank team when Karima was there. We were working very closely on a possibility of planting the seeds of an institution inside either the central, the Council of Ministers or the municipality. It was impossible to plant that seed. It was very much resisted. But I do agree that we can learn a lot from these conditions that allowed this institutional building to happen, that will help these synergies between civil society and government representatives that are true public servants to collide and to move things forward more sustainably. Thank you.
Thanks, Mona. Jerry, did you want to respond to Mona's question and reflect on the CSO selections?
Absolutely. From a practical perspective, I can say that the CSO selection and also making sure that their engagement is real and they actually are efficient. On our part, it's done via certain platforms that have been created within the network of civil protection. Just to outline and give you an example, at the local level, we do have those not workshops, but we do have these work groups where we plan, we prepare, and we plan and prepare disaster risk reduction activities and also disaster response. So within those groups, we make sure that we open those groups so that the people that are in the civil society within the area, they can participate. Now, once they get on board, they understand what the mechanisms are, they see what it is, and they actually can get on board they can actually get on board and be operational. And those operations need to be carried out from the preparation and mitigation phase, because as you know, when you take the cycle of disaster management, there's no beginning and there's no end, but there is this specific point where things are quote unquote calm and you can actually work strategically. So that's when you get them on board, you work with them, and within that timing, you can see which ones are effective, which ones are interested, which ones are impactful, and those that are not, they kind of lag or get left behind, quote unquote. Of course, we try to, even those that get left behind, we try to reel them in because they represent various levels and various groups in the society, and some of these groups are important to be part of the decision-making process in terms of disaster management and disaster response at large. So that's more or less the idea. Unfortunately, it will never be even across the board. I mean, I gave the example of the local level, the local and department level, and you will never have everyone at the same level, everyone moving at the same pace. But at the end, you get that involvement. And as those that are involved get moving and get involved and get to be participating in the DRM, those that were lagging, they tend to get interested because they see and they understand how it works. They see the results, they see the impact, and especially when it comes to the response, they see how important their participation should be. And this is, like I would say, some form of incentive to actually get them on board. To answer the question of Dr. Mona in regards to how the institutionalization of the civil protection, well, I would say it's a long story. And it's a long and very complex story, but also it was also a question of context as well. Civil protection, as Michel stated in his introduction, civil protection has been put in place since the 2000s, and the first national strategic plan was posted and ratified in 2003. But as you can see, the institution became Direction Générale in 2020. So it took us about 17 years of work, of creating relationships, of creating trust. And this is also the big, I would say, the big component. Creating trust so that the political level can understand the importance and the role of disaster risk management at large, and what it can bring to them in terms of strategic positioning. That's how, and I mean, those are the seeds towards really strengthening and institutionalizing. Like I said, there is no given formula. It's not written. I mean, what happened in Haiti is not necessarily what's going to be happening in Lebanon. I mean, the contexts are different, the politics are different, as you said yourself. But yeah, the bottom line, in my humble opinion, remains in the results that that can be brought, and the fruits that can be harvested from patients' work, and the harnessing of all the tools that are at hand. And the first tool remains the human resources. You have to be able to value the people, make sure that you give them the tools and the resources so they can actually do the work. And once you do that, it will become easier, quote unquote, to actually bring the rest. I mean, in terms of capacity building, trust of the donors and the international partners, and so forth and so on. So again, it is a gigantic puzzle, but it can be done. It can be done. And again, I remain available. I will send you my my email. We can exchange a little bit more about that directly. Over.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. Chandler. We are running out of time, but I do want to open it up to 1 or 2 questions from the floor. David, do you want to come in?
Hi, everybody. It's David Bernstein. I'm a lead public sector specialist based in Washington, D.C., but working in the MENA region. Dr. Harb, I'm actually the co-chair of one of those working groups on anti-corruption, which has now been expanded to cover public administration and civil service issues. Also was one of the original authors of the governance chapter of the 3RF report and the framework. So I listened very closely to your analysis or your assessment of kind of where the 3RF is and what it has done and what it hasn't done. I don't have any real arguments with your conclusions and your results. I think there's a bit of context that needs to be brought in, and there was one entity which I don't think you mentioned, which is the independent oversight body, which also is a body with the civil society participation and organization, which was intended to do and to provide kind of an outside assessment and evaluation of how the 3RF was working. And it's also had kind of its own constraints and has kind of moved in fits and starts over the time. The context is that for the bank, from my experience, I've been in the institution for almost 20 years, is that the way we switched to work after the blast in Lebanon wasn't an evolution of the bank's way of operating, it was a revolution. The idea that we were going to both raise money through the Lebanon financing facility and then only program through UN organizations or civil society organizations or the private sector is not something this institution, and people can correct me if they have other experiences, but in my experience, it's not something this institution is set up to do. And it certainly isn't set up to do it quickly or to do it well. And unfortunately, I think the delays and the processes that we had to go through in Lebanon, just for me at least, validated that experience. And I think that makes a big difference, at least on the reconstruction side of things, as to how things worked or didn't work. On the reform and the kind of policy conditionality and the rest of it, this is for another discussion, which I hope you and I can have next time I visit Beirut. But the political situation, and which was raised in one of the questions, it's really a question as to what any of these entities can propose or can do as far as legislative or even just policy reforms when you have literally a stalemate where there is no president, there's a caretaker government. The parliament, I believe, acted yesterday and may have acted unconstitutionally on the public procurement law because it's only supposed to meet to elect a president. At least that's one interpretation of the Constitution. And yet they amended the public procurement law with almost no debate and no discussion. And at the same time, they delayed elections, municipal elections. And which, in a parliamentary session that was boycotted by 1/3 of the MPs or some number around there. So it's really mind-boggling for those of us that work in governance, which is my primary area, as to how we work in the context of a situation where there essentially is no government. There's no government performing services because of the economic crisis and the currency crisis, and then there's no government to make decisions because of the political crisis and the constitutional crisis. So I think the inability for anyone to move things forward, let alone these new 3RF structures to move things forward, I think really needs to be brought out and taken into consideration. That said, it's not an excuse for the delays and the time it took most of us and most of these entities to get up and running. That's a fact now, an unfortunate fact, and a valid point of your assessment. So, but again, I hope to continue this conversation with you next time I'm in Beirut. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I would very much like that. Please do reach out when you visit. And I don't know if can I respond, or would you like to take more questions?
Of course, briefly. Yeah, thanks.
Sure. I wanted to say on the independent oversight board that I totally agree. I think this is missing from our analysis. When we started this project, the IOB was just put in place, and as we moved, it started doing things, and we decided to keep it out of the object of our study for just the reasons of scope, and we wanted to close. But I totally agree that this is the experience of the IOB is very interesting to document and to add to our analysis, especially that now they are also working on monitoring the work of the 3RF, and recent conversations that I had with the Secretariat of the 3RF, they were sharing that they're also attempting to work with the novel modalities of engagement with other civil society organizations. So I think, yes, absolutely, one needs to update our assessment with taking into consideration the IOB. The rest, I concur totally. I mean, I think the World Bank itself said that the government of Lebanon is privileging deliberate inaction, right? These were the words. And coming from the World Bank, this is a huge qualifier. So how do we operate as CSOs, as international organizations, as political groups, civil society groups who want to advance values and principles of inclusion and social justice when we have a government that's not only not working, but that is working to paralyze, I would say, or to hollow out the little progress that is done. I mean, this is, if it's a session on, I can spend hours just talking about what the government is doing to undermine a lot of the actions that many people are trying to do in this place against all the odds. So I totally concur with you, and I think again the Lebanon case study raises very serious questions about the validity of conditional aid in such context. Is it valid to provide conditional aid to contexts where the government is to that extent working against the making of a social contract?
Thanks so much, Mona. I want to encourage those of you who might have additional questions to forward them to myself or Karima or Mona or Jerry directly. This was such a super rich conversation. I want to hand it over to Niels now to bring everything together. Niels?
I thought it was meant to close, not bring everything together, because I'm not going to pretend that I'm going to be able to bring everything together from this rich conversation. Well, first off, I want to thank Dr. Chan and Dr. Hart for your fantastic presentations. This really was super interesting. I also want to thank Michelle and Naraya and Spiros for your comments and you giving it a bit more of a bankish angle to the real world presentations we were hearing from our outsiders participating. And then, of course, thank my own team, Karima and Mary, for setting up the conversation in the first place. We as a unit, GFDRR, as a global unit within the World Bank, we in this, not so much because we think we can solve many of the governance issues that you all brought up, but because we know that working on disaster risk management, which is our purpose and the primary skill set, plays out and works in different ways when the governance context and the challenges that you've all been talking about are so very different than from many of the other countries where we work. So obviously we need to learn and understand as much as we can about what works and doesn't work and how to work in a place where governance doesn't work. Also on topics like DRM, as fast as we can. We are in the business of learning from you, learning with you, passing on this knowledge to as many bank and DRM professionals as we can, as fast as we can. So I really personally appreciate that you're taking the time to talk with us and share some of your experience. I do tend to think that there's I was trying to figure out what am I learning from this. No, it's sort of you both described some really complicated situations. And it's a little bit like, gee, yeah, if there's no government, then there's a lot of things that don't work. Or if there is a constant set of pressures of political, institutional, external shocks, then a lot of other things don't work. But I do say, I get a sense from my own experience working on disaster risk management and maybe from the somewhat success story that Jerry is telling us about the civil defense and what has been achieved in Haiti in a very complicated governance context, that sometimes the disaster itself is a unifier, and sometimes the disaster itself is apolitical, especially when it's clearly external. It's not so clear that it was external in the case of Lebanon, the big explosion, because it was an explosion. But sometimes I do think we see in our line of work that that external shock creates a unifying element that enables institution building, institution strengthening, that may enable some of that sustained engagement that Michelle was mentioning and that Jerry was also mentioning, that may enable to build institutions or at least elements of institutional capacity that could take on a bigger role. And in a sense, disaster risk management sometimes becomes an entry point for an institution like us that, as David was saying, we're really not set up to not work with a government, which of course challenges enormously when we then have to work in a context where the government is not as efficient as other governments might be. But so I guess that's why we DRM people keep getting dragged into this space of FCV. It's not because we are FCV experts or by think, even pretend to be. But there seems to be something in that space that makes us a good and hopefully a good partner with those of you who come at it from a different angle than us. We will certainly stay in it with GFDRR. As I said, we're trying to learn as fast as we can. Karima and Mary is our glue in the learning process. I hope we will continue to work with all of you. And finally, thanks to those of you who connected to simply listen in. I hope we continue to work together moving forward. And I want to say finally that, as Mary said in her introduction, this was the third in a series of events that we're trying to organize. That almost means there's going to be a fourth. It's going to be next month. So those of you World Bankers who are interested in this topic, please rejoin. Please bring in some other colleagues and other counterparts that might be interested. And let's see how far we can get together. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Just to say that the fourth event will be on early warning systems in FCV contexts. For those of you who would be interested in the topic, we'll circulate the announcement very soon. But thank you very much, everyone.
Great. Thanks. We'll close with that, and you'll receive a copy of the presentations as well as the recording in your emails. Have a great day.